Hello, students. We're moving into a more industrialized Minnesota with Chapter 11. We'll talk about big industries in Minnesota, which is flour. Minneapolis becomes known as the Mill City. You guys might have even been to the Mill City Museum. Lumber. This is an area of thick forested land all the way from northern Minnesota to the southern end of Minnesota. Out west, more sparsely forest, but uh, in the area that we live in right here, it's even still very wooded in some areas today. Also, iron up on the Iron Range in northern Minnesota, and some of that iron will actually become used to help prop us up during World War II. So, a very important time for Minnesota history. Chapter 11, this is going to be one of two sections that we're going to do. This will be part one. It's a very long chapter, so we'll start with flour, lumber, and iron on page 156. The trains chugged across the landscape during the late 1800s, signaled the arrival of a new era in Minnesota. It was a time of big machines and big businesses. Companies had been owned by more than one person or by several partners grew into corporations. Companies with many owners, called stockholders, by forming a corporation and selling stock. Businesses could bring together money of many people. This allowed them to hire more workers, buy expensive machinery, and expand their operations. Entire industries developed that specialized in certain products and services. The railroad industry was one example of this trend, but there were many others. Minnesota's early economy, three industries became particularly important: flour milling, lumbering, and iron mining. Each of these industries succeeded by finding the right mix of at least three ingredients: natural resources that could be used to make products, machines that made it easier to use those natural resources, and people who were willing to invest money, ideas, and physical labor to make use of both natural resources and machines to make products. Minnesota's flour milling, lumber, and iron mining industries took advantage of these and other factors to grow bigger and more profitable during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Their owners became rich, their workers earned a living, and in the process, employers and employees often found themselves at odds with each other. An industrialist story: Charles Pillsbury and the flour milling industry. Minneapolis was a town of small businesses when 27-year-old Charles Pillsbury arrived in 1869. Pillsbury had grown up in New Hampshire, and he learned the ins and outs of the business world while working for a company that distributed farm products to markets in Montreal. He had come to Minneapolis to go into business for himself, and he was thinking big, not small. The business he chose was flour milling. Flour mills had been grinding wheat into flours at the Falls of St. Anthony for 15 years by the time Pillsbury arrived. But the amount of flour produced at those mills was small compared to the production of major milling centers such as St. Louis, Missouri. Pillsbury and a few other industrials set out to change that. A few years after arriving in Minneapolis, Pillsbury became part owner of a failing flour mill. He knew he was taking a gamble. The other fellows in the business rather pitied me, he recalled, and said that another poor devil had got caught in the milling business. But Pillsbury didn't need pity. He knew he was getting into a tough business and worked hard to succeed. Within 5 years, his business was flourishing. Soon after, he could afford to make improvements to his mill and buy additional ones. By the late 1870s, production at his mills had increased from 300 barrels of flour a day to 3,000 barrels a day. Other mill owners also expanded their operations in Minneapolis with similar increases in production. Such rapid expansion resulted from a combination of natural resources, new machines, and the efforts of people. Page 158, you can see a picture of Charles Pillsbury. And if you know the Pillsbury Doughboy and Pillsbury food products, that's the Pillsbury we're talking about. 159, the flour milling equation. In many ways, the flour milling industry's success with water power, the cascading waters of the Falls of St. Anthony, turned the turbines that spun the shafts that powered the grindstones inside the mills. But the industry would not have thrived without new machines. The investment and efforts of industrialists and workers and the growing demand for flour by families across the United States and Europe. Natural resources. The rich farmlands of southern and western Minnesota had a soil that was ideal for growing wheat, which was a preferred grain of the flour millers. As more farmers moved into the state, the supply of wheat increased dramatically, from 1,400 bushels in 1850 to nearly 19 million bushels in 1870. More than 52 million in 1890. Minnesota had become the leading wheat producing state in the nation. Of course, this growth in wheat production did not just happen. The state's expanding railroad system was making it easier to move the wheat from farms to the mills, opening new markets for the farmers' grain. Machines. Until the 1870s, flour made from Minnesota wheat was speckled with brown specks of bran, a flaw that made bread less appealing, slower to rise, and faster to decay than white pure flour did. In Pillsbury's words, it was way down at the bottom of the heap. But then, the Minneapolis millers started using new machines that greatly improved the quality of their flour. One machine was called the Middlings Purifier, removed brown flecks, and turned Minnesota wheat into pure white flour that consumers preferred. Steel rollers ground the flour finer and faster than the old millstones, improving the quality and increasing the production of wheat flour. By the early 1880s, Minnesota flour was considered among the best in the world. People. Charles Pillsbury and the other Minneapolis flour mill owners, employed thousands of people. The highest paid workers were the ones who tended the huge machines at the mills. Their jobs were also the most dangerous. Many lost an arm or a hand in the big machines. The packers who caught the flour in the barrel and bags as it poured off the assembly line were among the lowest paid workers in the mills. Those workers who nailed flour barrels shut and who swept the floors also received low wages. The unskilled jobs were boring and repetitive, and they offered little chance of moving up to better paying jobs. By 1880, Charles Pillsbury and his fellow mill owners had, with considerable help from their workers, turned Minneapolis into the nation's leading flour producer. As production rose, large milling companies began buying up small milling companies. By 1890, 4 corporations accounted for 87% of the city's flour production. Those 4 corporations was C.A. Pillsbury, and company was the largest. A worker's story. Horace Glenn and the lumber industry. Minnesota's lumber industry was operating at its peak in the winter of 1900 to 1901 when 21-year-old Horace Glenn arrived in Minnesota in northeastern Arrowhead region to work as a lumberjack. Glenn had come for money and adventure. He considered himself well-educated and well-mannered, the superior of other lumberjacks he worked with. But in letters to his parents in Aberdeen, South Dakota, he said he was glad to be there. I enjoy the work better than I ever did before. For me, sawing is the best job in the woods. Time passes quickly, and although it is very cold, from 0 to 30 below so far, you don't notice it much in the timber, and what I eat at home would scarcely be a light lunch for me here. Horace Glenn worked as a swamper, cutting branches off felled trees. For Glenn and his fellow lumberjacks, the day started at 4 in the morning. They woke up, ate a big breakfast of pancakes, pork, and beans, and headed out into the woods for the rest of the day. Snow, rain, or shine, the camp's cook brought lunch at midday. In the winter, most lumberjacks learned to eat quickly before the food froze. After returning to camp, they ate dinner, and headed to the bunkhouse. Most were asleep by 9 o'clock. Lumberjacks had one day off, Sunday. Men occasionally attended church services conducted by traveling ministers, but mostly they spent their day playing cards, writing letters, and paying at least a little attention to personal hygiene. If nothing else, it was a day to boil your clothes and kill the lice that infested them. Horace Glenn tried his best to stay clean, but it was difficult with no running water, little soap, and shared bath water. I have the barber's itch now, he wrote his parents, describing a rash caused by skin fungus. My face is a fright, but it's healing up. By March, Glenn was itching to join up with a work crew on the springtime log drive. All winter, workers stacked logs by the side of the river. When the ice melted on the river, the crews drove the logs downstream to the sawmills. Log driving was dangerous work, but the wages were good, as much as $2.50 a day. Glenn hoped to make enough money on the river to pay for a trip back to South Dakota. The lumber equation. River and waterfalls were just as important as the lumber industry as they were to the flour milling industry. Rivers served as transportation highways for millions of logs, and you can see how much the logs were at Taylor's Falls in 1856 on page 162. It's an amazing thing that people could walk across the river on the back of the logs. Lumber companies built sawmills and booms, where logs were sorted and stored at several of the state's waterfalls. Towns grew up near the sawmills and booms as people came to work in the industry. Natural resources. For hundreds of years, vast forests of white pine, a tree highly prized for its quality lumber, covered much of northern Minnesota. The white pine could grow more than 125 feet, and the straight trunks had no branches for many feet above the ground. These straight and strong trees made for superior boards of construction. The logging in Minnesota began in the 1830s. It wasn't until the 1880s that lumber companies started making major investments of money, machines, and people to harvest the trees. Machines, crosscut saws, axes, hammers, and hooks were always important to the tools of the lumberjack trade. But as the years went on, the companies invented new machines to make businesses more efficient. Hot water pumps kept the water near the sawmills from freezing so the mills could run all the water. Faster steam-powered saws helped increase the lumber production. But few innovations were as important as the railways. At first, most logs were hauled to the rivers by horses and floated downstream to the mills. But in the 1890s, lumber companies started using freight trains to move logs out of the forests that weren't near rivers. People. Lumberjacks like Horace Glenn provided the muscle to fell the trees to send the logs downriver, but they were just part of the story. Minnesota's lumber industry would never have it developed as quickly as without business owners like Frederick Weyerhaeuser. In 1890, Weyerhaeuser and his big partners made their first big investment in Minnesota, purchasing a hard-to-reach timberland in the central part of the state. He eventually expanded control to his sawmills, booms, and small railroad lines. Because he controlled every step of the lumbering process, he could tightly control costs and profits. By 1900, more than 400 lumber companies, including several belonging to Weyerhaeuser, were operating in the state, and Minnesota ranked third in the nation in lumber production. Towns and cities throughout the Midwest were built using Minnesota lumber. It was probably a good thing that Horace Glenn didn't want to make a career out of lumberjacking. By 1905, Minnesota's white pines had been cut down, and lumber production was beginning to decline. Minnesota started talking seriously about conserving trees and planting new ones, but by then it was too late. Many lumber mills in Minnesota closed, and lumber operations moved west to uncut white pine forests. Lumberjacks who wanted to keep working in the lucrative white pine forest had to follow the companies west. Others turned to harvesting different kinds of trees. The rest had to find new work. Horace Glenn never returned to the lumber camps. He became a lawyer instead. That'll end this section.